In the quiet, sun-baked sprawl of a Texas town, cradled close to the border, the year 1981 became etched in local memory as the moment an unthinkable sorrow descended. 3 identical triplet boys, vibrant and full of life, vanished without a trace. One moment, their laughter echoed in the front yard of their family home, the next, an eerie silence. Decades bled into one another, offering no answers, no solace, only a gnawing emptiness. Then, 30 years later, a flicker of something hidden in an old photograph caught her mother's eye. A detail so small, yet so profound, it would unravel everything she thought she knew. The afternoon sun, a benevolent golden tide, poured over a modest suburban neighborhood just outside Laredo, Texas. It was a Saturday, drowsy and familiar, and the air hummed with the gentle symphony of a community at rest. Yet in the Rodriguez family's backyard, a different kind of energy buzzed, the joyous cacophony of children's laughter. Balloons, buoyant and colorful, danced in the soft breeze, tethered to folding tables that groaned under the weight of chip bowls and stacks of vibrant paper plates. It was Tommy Rodriguez's 8th birthday, and true to generations of tradition, the neighborhood had gathered to celebrate. Evie Marlowe, a woman whose 60 years had etched a quiet elegance into her posture, stood near the garden fence, adjusting the brim of her wide sun hat. Though time had softened her edges, her frame still carried the indelible weight of a sorrow no mother should ever know. Fine lines fanned out from eyes that had spent 30 years scanning crowds, always hoping, never truly finding. By the grill, her husband Walter, 2 years her senior, engaged in light chatter with a few other men, expertly flipping burgers and sipping sweet tea. He had aged with the quiet, unyielding resilience of a man who had weathered a storm of heartbreak, wearing his grief like a second, familiar skin. Evie offered polite, half-hearted smiles as her neighbor, Martha, prattled on about the resilience of tomato vines and the persistent menace of garden beetles. But her attention, a fragile thing, fractured in an instant. A flicker of movement by the patio door. A man, utterly unfamiliar, stepped into the yard, his hand clasping that of a young boy, no older than 8. "Sorry we're late," the man called out, his tone easy, casual. "Had a little situation at home."
Before he could elaborate, the boy wriggled free, a blur of youthful energy, and darted towards the other children. As he zipped past Evie, her breath hitched, caught in her throat. He wore green checkered overalls, adorned with bright yellow straps, an exact replica of the outfits her own boys had worn. The same distinctive pattern, the very same hue of green, even the familiar long-sleeved shirt peeking out from beneath. His dark curls, a cascade of youthful exuberance, bounced with each step, and for a fleeting, disorienting second, time warped. Evie's heart slammed against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in her chest. Without a conscious thought, she stepped forward, moving with a speed she hadn't known she possessed. Her hand, gentle yet insistent, landed on the boy's shoulder, turning him around. "Where did you get those clothes?" she whispered, her voice barely a breath. Her fingers trembling with the phantom touch of a long-lost memory, hovered near his dark curls. The boy's eyes widened, startled, like a deer caught in headlights. In an instant, he recoiled, bolting towards his father. "Daddy! Daddy!" he cried, his voice sharp with a sudden, unreasoning fear. The man looked up, alarmed, and moved swiftly, protectively toward his son, placing a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his tone wary, though not yet edged with anger. Curiosity laced his voice, but his stance was unmistakably guarded. "She touched me!" he blurted out, clinging to his father's side, his fear palpable. "She scared me." The father's eyes narrowed, a subtle shift. "Ma'am, what's going on? Why did you grab my son?" Evie opened her mouth, but no sound emerged. Her gaze, however, remained riveted on the boy's clothes. Her hand lifted, stopping just shy of touching the fabric once more. "Those overalls, where did you get them?" "Excuse me." His voice sharpened, and he stepped in front of his son, a shield. "What's your problem, lady?" Before Evie could formulate an explanation, Walter appeared at her side, his presence a silent anchor. He had sensed the sudden shift, the tension in the air. He slipped a protective arm around her shoulders, his gaze moving from the wary father to the frightened boy.
"I'm sorry," Walter said calmly, though his fingers gripped Evie's shoulder tighter than usual. "My wife didn't mean to scare anyone." He glanced down at the boy, and his expression, usually so stoic, softened with a flicker of recognition. "Those clothes," he said quietly, "our sons wore outfits just like that. Green overalls, yellow straps, long sleeves, identical." The man blinked, his confusion slowly yielding to something akin to compassion. "Our boys were triplets," Walter added, his grief, which 30 years had failed to diminish. "They disappeared in 1981. We never found out what happened." A sudden hush fell over the sunlit yard. Neighbors, drawn by the hushed, intense exchange, turned quietly, listening. Mrs. Rodriguez, her face etched with a familiar sadness, stepped forward. "It's true. The Marlowe boys were taken from this neighborhood. It was devastating. Everyone searched for weeks." The man looked down at his son, then back at Walter, a wave of empathy washing over his features. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know, I swear. I bought these at a department store months ago. I can't remember which one." Evie stepped closer, her voice trembling but clear, an urgent plea. "Please, may I see the tag? I just need to know if it's the same brand." Walter gently placed a steadying hand on his wife's shoulder. "Evie, sweetheart," he said softly, his voice laced with tender caution. "That little boy, he's not Lucas. He's not Noah or Gabriel. Let's not frighten him more than we already have." Turning to the man, Walter offered a sincere nod. "I'm truly sorry. My wife didn't mean any harm. It's been a hard day." Mrs. Rodriguez, ever the thoughtful neighbor, stepped in, placing a comforting hand on Evie's arm. "Evie, dear, you're shaking. Maybe it's best if you went home and got some rest." Walter offered Mrs. Rodriguez a grateful smile. "Yes, I think that's a good idea. Thank you for everything." He looked at the father and son, extending a respectful hand. "I wish we were meeting under better circumstances." The man's face softened with genuine compassion. "I'm truly sorry if we caused any distress. We just moved in. I thought coming to the party would be a nice way to meet the neighborhood." "It's not your fault," Walter replied quickly, a dismissive wave of his hand. "Really?" With that, he gently guided Evie out of the backyard. The warm breeze rustled through the trees as they began the quiet walk home, a mere 3 blocks away, yet each step felt heavier than the last, laden with unspoken sorrow and rekindled pain. Inside, Walter helped Evie to the couch, a soft haven, then disappeared into the kitchen. Minutes later, the kettle's mournful whistle pierced the silence, and he returned with a cup of tea, its delicate steam curling into the heavy quiet between them. He helped her lift it to her lips, his hand a steadying presence beneath hers. Evie's eyes, shimmering with unshed tears, finally spilled over. "I didn't mean to scare that little boy. When I saw those clothes—" Walter nodded gently, settling beside her. "I know. It was a panic attack. You couldn't help it." "I can't let go, Walter," she said, her voice cracking under the insurmountable weight of a grief that, even after 30 years, had never truly faded. Walter took her hand, holding it tightly, a silent promise. "They'd be grown now," he said, his voice tinged with a wistful ache. "All three of them. Men with lives of their own, maybe families, jobs." "I know," Evie whispered, her gaze lost in the middle distance. "And I still talk about them like they're just away. I must sound foolish, always making people uncomfortable, clinging to ghosts." Walter shook his head, a gentle, firm negation. "You're not foolish. You're their mother. And I felt it too when I saw that boy. The overalls, the green plaid, the yellow straps. It was like being hit by a memory we didn't ask for." Evie slowly sat up, her eyes searching his, a flicker of renewed purpose in their depths. "I want to see the photos again, the ones where they're wearing those outfits." Walter hesitated, a familiar weariness in his voice. "They're still in the attic. We haven't opened that box in over 20 years. "Please," Evie said, her voice clear now, infused with a newfound resolve. "I want to see them again. Maybe if I see them again, I'll calm down." Walter sighed but nodded. "All right, I'll get it." She listened as his footsteps receded up the stairs, then the soft creak of the attic ladder, a sound that echoed through the quiet house like a whisper from the past. Moments passed, punctuated by the rustle of cardboard. Then he returned, carefully carrying a worn box, its edges dulled with time, its surface blanketed in a fine layer of dust. He placed it gently on the coffee table and, with an old kitchen towel, meticulously wiped it clean. Together, they lifted the lid. Inside lay the fragile remnants of a life interrupted. Tiny toys, a trio of well-loved baseball gloves, and 3 matching stuffed bears with fur faded from countless embraces. There were sheets of schoolwork, adorned with gold stars, and innocent drawings of rockets and rainbows. Each piece a frozen moment, a poignant shard from a childhood cruelly cut short. "The photo album should be at the bottom," Walter said, his voice catching, thick with emotion. "We packed it last." Layer by precious layer, they lifted the relics of the past until finally the leather-bound book emerged. Walter's hands trembled slightly as he placed it on his lap. The cover, once a deep, rich brown, had softened over the years to a warm amber, mute testament to countless hours of handling, though it hadn't been opened in decades. Side by side, they sat on the sofa as he carefully opened it. The first page held the beginning of everything. 3 identical newborns, swaddled in striped blankets, sleeping side by side in a hospital bassinet. Then came photos of them crawling in unison, toddlers taking their first wobbly steps across the living room carpet, birthday parties captured in flickering light, 3 tiny faces blowing out candles together in perfect synchrony. And then they turned the page. "They were always so in sync," Evie whispered, her finger lightly tracing across a photograph of the boys building a sandcastle, sunlight sparkling off the waves behind them. Their small hands worked in tandem, 3 little architects shaping their kingdom of sand, their laughter frozen in the grainy texture of the image. Walter turned the pages with a reverence born of profound loss, and they paused at each one, letting memories wash over them like warm waves. Trips to the park, sticky faces from melted popsicles, a trio of birthdays celebrated with matching cakes and identical candles. Then they found it, the photo they had been searching for. The triplets stood proudly in front of the old White House, shoulder to shoulder in their green checkered overalls with bright yellow straps. Their long-sleeved shirts peeked out from underneath the fabric, and all 3 wore the same broad, beaming smile, the kind only childhood could conjure. Arms linked, they looked unbreakable, invincible. Walter's voice broke the silence, thick with a painful recognition. "This was taken the morning they disappeared.
just 1 hour before they were gone. Evie leaned closer, studying the fabric with a renewed, intense focus. "Look," she said, her eyes narrowing. "The overalls, they're similar to what that boy wore at the party, but not the same. The green is darker, more vintage, and the checkered pattern is wider."
Walter nodded, his own gaze sharp. And the straps. His were thinner, different stitching, different cut. Same style, but definitely not the same garment. Evie sighed deeply, rubbing her eyes, a wave of weariness washing over her. I feel awful about how I reacted to that boy. And his father, what were their names again? Malvin, Walter answered, and his dad is Rowan. They moved into the neighborhood a few months ago. I need to apologize, she said, shaking her head, remorse etched on her face. I must have scared that poor child. I couldn't help it. They fell into a quiet rhythm again, gazing at the photo that had once been so ordinary, now carrying the immeasurable weight of unspeakable loss. Walter chuckled softly as Evie recalled how Gabriel had insisted on wearing his overalls backward that morning, proudly declaring he was cooler that way, until she coaxed him into switching them. And how Noah had somehow found a mud puddle before breakfast and stained his knee. "Typical Noah," she murmured, a bittersweet smile touching her lips. As Walter poured himself another cup of tea, Evie suddenly jolted forward, poking his arm and nearly causing him to spill. "Walter, look at the background," she said urgently, pointing at the far corner of the photograph. "Isn't that the Cadillac, the one Lucas was obsessed with?" Walter set down the teapot and squinted at the image. Just behind the boys, barely in frame, was the gleaming front end of a reddish-brown Cadillac parked across the street. The shape was unmistakable. "You're right," he murmured, his brow tightening with a dawning unease. "Lucas loved that car. Every time we passed it, he'd beg me to stop so he could look inside. He even had a toy version of it." "That's Mr. Howard Fielding's Cadillac," Evie said, her voice rising, a sudden spark of revelation. "Their old school teacher, remember? He barely drove it, said it was his pride and joy." Walter nodded slowly, his memory stirring, reluctantly awakening. Everyone knew that car. It was like a legend in our town. The kids adored him in that car. "We were such a close-knit community back then," Evie murmured, her voice tinged with nostalgia. "Everyone looked out for everyone else. And Mr. Howard, he was so gentle with the children, so patient. The boys loved him." She turned the photo over, her fingers searching for a date or a scribbled note. Nothing. Then she turned it back and studied the background again. Her face darkened, a shadow falling over her features. "Walter, are you absolutely sure this was taken the day they vanished?" He looked at her, puzzled. "Yes, I remember clearly. You took it just before we left for the park." Evie's eyes filled with a sudden, chilling suspicion. But Howard Fielding had already moved away by then. Remember, the school held a going-away party for him. It was a big deal. The whole town was there. It was the day before this photo was supposedly taken.
Walter's breath caught in his throat. The timeline didn't add up, and for the first time in years, doubt, cold and insidious, crept in like a shadow on a sunny day. Walter furrowed his brow, trying to reconcile the conflicting memories. "I'm sure that photo was taken the morning they vanished. They didn't go missing until later that afternoon." Evie leaned forward, her eyes scanning the image again, a desperate urgency in her gaze. "But that's just it," she said, her voice tight with a dawning horror. "Mr. Howard had already moved away by then. He told everyone he was leaving town a week before, so why is his Cadillac in this photo?" Walter set the album aside and turned back to the old box. rummaging through the layers of childhood keepsakes, papers shuffled, cardboard bent with age. Then he paused, his hand pulling out a familiar yellowed Kodak envelope, brittle at the edges. "This," he said, holding it up, "this is the original film envelope. Look." He flipped it over to show the faded ink stamp. The film was developed 2 days after the boys disappeared. That confirms it. This photo was taken the morning they vanished. Evie hugged her arms to her chest, shivering despite the warm air in the living room. A chill, cold and unsettling, crept down her spine. If that really was Mr. Howard's car, then he might have seen something that day, something suspicious, something important. She paused, her thoughts unraveling with terrifying speed. But if the police ever questioned him, they never told us. They never mentioned him, which means he must have been long gone, right? Walter noticed the panic rising in her voice. He placed a calm, reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Evie, maybe it's not his car. Could have been a coincidence. A similar model, a neighbor's visitor, maybe even someone passing through." Evie shook her head, a stubborn resolve in her eyes. "No one else on our block owned a Cadillac, not that color, not that model. We were a tight-knit community. We knew everything about each other." "Maybe someone had guests that day," Walter said gently, trying to offer a logical explanation. "The police looked at every single photo we gave them. They questioned everyone. If that really was Mr. Howard's Cadillac, they would have caught it. They would have tracked the plates. They would have told us." Evie inhaled deeply as he handed her the tea again. The warmth seeped into her fingers, a small anchor slowing her racing thoughts. "You're probably right," she said quietly, the conviction not quite reaching her voice. "It's probably nothing." Walter exhaled with relief and closed the album, as if sealing away the painful memories once more. Still, Evie carefully slid the photograph out and held it in her lap. She didn't want to let it go. Together, they began returning the contents to the box, each small item a tender relic of what once was, a love preserved in toys and trinkets and quiet memories. Walter glanced at the ornate clock on the mantel and suddenly stood upright. "Good grief, I completely lost track of time. My checkup's at 11:50 and it's already 11:30. Evie looked up startled. "It's Saturday. The clinic closes at 1. You better go."
They scrambled gently but quickly. She handed him his insurance card, his list of medications, and the small notebook where he'd logged his blood pressure readings. In less than 5 minutes, he was ready to go. At the door, he turned back, a flicker of concern in his eyes. "Are you sure you'll be all right by yourself?" "I'll be fine," Evie smiled, brushing his sleeve. "I'll make lunch, maybe nap a bit this afternoon. Dinner will be waiting when you get back. Don't worry about me." Walter kissed her cheek, and with one last lingering look, hurried to the car. As the sound of the engine faded, Evie walked into their bedroom and picked up her phone. A new message lit up the screen from Louise Mitchell, an old friend who'd worked on the school board for nearly 30 years. "Annual school district retirees reunion coming up next month. Hope to see you and Walter there. We miss you both." Evie sat down on the edge of the bed, staring at the message. Louise, of course. She would have worked closely with Mr. Howard. If anyone had answers, it was her. Evie didn't want to jump to conclusions. She didn't want to suspect Mr. Howard of anything. He'd been such a gentle man, beloved by students and parents alike. But that image, that car, had stirred something she couldn't ignore. Without overthinking it, she tapped Louise's contact and pressed call. "Evie, what a lovely surprise!" Louise's cheerful voice filled the line. "Did you get my text about the reunion?" "I did. Walter and I will try to make it. It's been far too long, Louise. How have you been?" The women chatted for several minutes, catching up on life, exchanging updates about grandchildren, retirement hobbies, and old neighbors. But eventually, Evie gently shifted the conversation. "Louise, do you remember Howard Fielding? He taught at Oak Ridge Elementary back in the early '80s. "Howard?" Louise laughed. "Of course I do. Talented, kind. Everybody loved him." "Do you know where he ended up after he left Oak Ridge?" Evie asked, trying to keep her tone casual, light. There was a pause. "Well, actually, Evie, I think you might be remembering it wrong," Louise said slowly, a slight hesitation in her voice. "Howard didn't go on teaching. Not in public schools, anyway. As far as I know, he never filed any transfer paperwork after he left Oak Ridge." Evie froze. The air in the room seemed to thicken, suddenly heavy. "What do you mean?" she asked quietly, her voice barely a whisper. "He never applied to another school in our district or any nearby. In fact, after he left, no one really heard much from him at all." "Transfer papers?" Evie sat up straighter, gripping the phone a little tighter, a sudden knot of dread tightening in her stomach. "He never filed any?" "No," Louise replied. "I know we all thought he was moving to teach somewhere else, but that's not what really happened. Maybe he was just saying that as a kind farewell? You know how warm-hearted he was." Evie blinked, stunned. "But we threw him a goodbye party. He said he was relocating to another district." Louise's voice softened. "I remember that, but from what I later heard, Howard moved to a remote area in Texas. He started some kind of private farm, a charity for immigrant children, I think." "Farm?" Evie repeated, utterly confused. "Yes, I believe it's a place where he helps boys and young men get back on their feet. He's doing good work. It's called... Wait, let me think. Ah, yes, Howard's Haven for Hope. That was the name." Evie repeated it quietly, the words feeling alien on her tongue. Howard's Haven for Hope. There was a long pause, filled only by the faint hum of the phone line. "Why are you suddenly asking about Howard?" Louise asked, her voice now tinged with curiosity.
Evie hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I was just looking through old photos, and I remembered his Cadillac. I saw one that looked exactly like it in a picture we took the day the boys disappeared." "Oh, yes," Louise said with a nostalgic chuckle. "He adored that car, that deep cherry Cadillac, but he hardly ever drove it. Said it was more of a collector's piece. Preferred his old sedan for errands." Evie felt her heart begin to race again, a frantic flutter in her chest. "Do you remember exactly when he left town?" He sighed. "Evie, that was so long ago, I honestly couldn't say for certain." They exchanged goodbyes, and as soon as the call ended, Evie headed straight to the home office. She powered on the old desktop computer and, with a newfound sense of purpose, typed Howard's Haven for Hope into the search bar. The website loaded slowly, a relic of an earlier internet era. It was plain, almost austere, with a modest banner image of a few smiling boys working on a farm, planting crops, tending animals, helping each other carry tools. Most of the children appeared to be of Mexican or Central American descent, all with bright, hopeful faces. Evie scrolled through the gallery, carefully inspecting each photo. Nothing looked suspicious. In fact, everything seemed wholesome, benign. The mission statement spoke of nurturing, education, structure, and support for immigrant youth. On the About page, Howard's face appeared again, a little older now, with graying hair and deeper lines around his kind smile. His brief biography noted his former career as an elementary school teacher, his passion for working with disadvantaged youth, and his vision for creating a safe space for growth and learning. Evie leaned closer to the screen.
The website listed an address tucked in a rural part of southern Texas. There was no phone number, just a generic contact email. She stared at the screen, debating. It had been 30 years. Was she overthinking this? Clinging to ghosts? Or was her gut telling her something real, something profound? Maybe should talk to Howard directly, show him the photo, ask if that Cadillac really was his. A glance at the clock told her it was 11:45. If she left now, she could reach the farm in early afternoon. The drive would take only about 90 minutes, and the weather was clear, promising. She picked up her phone and called Walter at the clinic. "Walter, how's the appointment going?" "I'm still in the waiting room. Everything okay?" "Yes," she said quickly, a breathless urgency in her voice. "But I found something. I talked to Louise. She told me Howard started a charity farm. It's called Howard's Haven for Hope. It's not far from here. I'd really like to go today." There was a pause, heavy with Walter's concern. "Evie, you're getting wrapped up in this Cadillac coincidence. I'm worried about you." "I'm fine," she assured him, a stubborn resolve hardening her tone. "I just want peace of mind. Howard was always good to the boys. If that really was his car, I'd like to ask him directly, maybe even reconnect. It could be nothing, but I'll never stop wondering if I don't check." Walter sighed on the other end. "Okay, but we should call him first, let him know we're coming." "I didn't find a phone number, just an email. I'll send a message, but there's no guarantee he'll see it in time." They agreed to meet at the clinic since it was on the way to the farm. Walter would finish his appointment, and Evie would take the bus to meet him there. "I'm leaving now," she said, already reaching for her purse. "See you soon." Evie stepped out of the house with a renewed sense of purpose, locking the door behind her and walking briskly down the sunlit sidewalk. The Texas heat was already building, pressing down on the streets with a thick humidity. She was grateful when the bus arrived, just as she reached the corner stop, the doors hissing open with a breath of cool, recycled air. The 15-minute ride to the medical clinic passed in a blur, her thoughts spinning faster than the wheels beneath her. Howard Fielding, the Cadillac, the boys. What if the answers had been just out of reach for all these years? As the bus slowed near the clinic, a young woman in a wide straw hat and a bright yellow T-shirt stood near the exit, handing out colorful flyers. "County Agricultural Fair this week," she chirped, flashing a bright smile, before moving on to the next passenger. Evie barely registered the flyer as it was thrust into her hand, but glanced down at it while walking towards the clinic. Bold letters advertised a week-long agricultural celebration. Livestock shows, tractor demos, crafts, and food stalls. But what caught her eye was today's featured event, a special equipment auction happening at a nearby ranch. It wasn't far from Howard's farm. That tug of intuition deepened. "Interesting," she murmured, folding the flyer and slipping it into her purse. Inside the clinic, she spotted Walter at the front desk, signing a receipt and collecting his insurance card. He smiled when he saw her. "Perfect timing," he said, tucking the paperwork away. "Dr. Matthews says I'm doing great. My blood pressure's come down since they adjusted my meds." "That's wonderful news," Evie replied, the warmth in her voice genuine. "Are you ready for our little adventure?" Minutes later, they were on the road, Walter behind the wheel of his sedan, following the GPS directions southward. The suburban landscape began to thin out, giving way to sprawling pastures, weathered wooden fences, and sun-bleached silos. Crops stretched for miles, swaying gently under the cloudless sky. "Any reply to the email yet?" Walter asked, eyes scanning the road. Evie shook her head. "Nothing." She reached into her purse and pulled out the flyer from earlier. "But look at this. Got it at the bus stop. There's a big agricultural fair happening all week. Today's auction is being held just a few miles from Howard's farm." Walter gave it a quick glance. "You think he might be there?" "It's possible," she said, unfolding the flyer across her lap. "The auction site's in the same general area, just a different address. Let's stick to our plan and visit the farm first. We can always swing by the fair afterward."
Walter nodded. Sounds good to me. The road narrowed, and the GPS directed them onto a gravel drive flanked by tall, wild grasses. A simple wooden sign stood at the turnoff, carved with 3 words, Howard's Haven for Hope. They exchanged a quiet glance, a shared flicker of anticipation and apprehension. The driveway stretched ahead, leading to a tidy cluster of buildings, an old farmhouse with a wide porch, a pair of weathered barns, and what looked like dormitories or residential cabins. The place was serene, almost too quiet, with only the faint rustle of trees and the distant hum of insects filling the air.
As they stepped out of the car, a young man emerged from one of the barns. He looked to be in his early 20s, Hispanic, with sun-darkened skin and calloused hands, dressed in worn jeans and a gray t-shirt. Walter raised a hand in greeting. "Hello there." The young man returned the wave, his smile open and friendly. "Hey, can I help you folks with something?" "We're looking for Howard Fielding," Evie said as she approached the young man. "Is this his farm?" "Yes, ma'am. This is Mr. Fielding's place." Walter stepped forward. "We didn't schedule an appointment. We're old friends. Howard was our son's teacher many years ago. We sent an email to the address on the website." "Oh," the young man said, his face brightening with understanding. "That's probably why no one replied. We switched email systems last month, but the website hasn't been updated yet. I'm really sorry." "Is he here?" Evie asked, trying not to let the disappointment creep into her voice. The young man shook his head. "No, I'm afraid not. Most of the staff and kids went to the county agricultural event. There's an auction today, and we're also running a booth to promote our program." Evie sighed, glancing back at the car. "We heard about it just before we arrived." She was already turning to leave when Walter gently touched her arm. "Wait," he said, turning back to the young man. "Since we're already here, would it be all right if we looked around a little? We'd love to see what Howard's built here. It's impressive." The young man hesitated for a second, then nodded. "Let me check with the supervisor on duty. Just a moment." He stepped aside and pulled out his phone, speaking in low tones. When he returned, he was smiling again. "It's fine. I'll give you a quick tour." For the next half hour, Evie and Walter followed him through the expansive property. He showed them the barns that housed livestock, the horse stables, and the rows of green crops stretching toward the tree line. As they walked, he explained the farm's mission to give immigrant children a safe space to live, learn, and build confidence through agriculture and education. "This one here," he said as they approached a colorful barn, "is especially for the younger kids. Mr. Fielding designed it as a creative space where they can play, explore, and just be kids." The barn's exterior was covered in joyful chaos, children's paintings, bright scribbles, shapes made of handprints. Inside, long tables were arranged with craft materials, dried beans, fabric scraps, glue, glitter, even cracked eggshells. Near the back, a man was arranging supplies on one of the tables. He looked up as they entered, a man in his 30s or 40s with thick black curls and fair skin. His smile was wide, almost too wide, lighting up his face in a way that was strangely familiar. "Ferdinand," the young guide called. "These are friends of Mr. Fielding. They stopped by hoping to see him." The man set down the supplies and approached, wiping his hands on a towel before extending one. "I'm Ferdinand, the activities coordinator. Nice to meet you." "Walter and Evie Marlowe," Walter said, shaking his hand. "We go way back with Howard." Ferdinand gestured towards the tables he'd been working on. "I'm setting up demos for some potential sponsors and community partners visiting this week. It's important they see how the children engage with the space." He moved around the room effortlessly, his hands quick and practiced, his voice full of enthusiasm. "I've been here a long time, since I was 6, actually. Mr. Fielding took me in when I had nowhere else to go." "Howard was a school teacher before all this," Evie said softly, her eyes fixed on him. "Our sons were in his class. He always had such a way with children." Ferdinand smiled warmly. "He still does. The kids look up to him like a father." They continued walking, taking in the vibrant artwork that filled an entire wall. Crayon rainbows, glued-on macaroni animals, nature collages made from bark and leaves. It was creative, chaotic, and beautiful. Then Evie saw it. A drawing stood out from the others, bright and meticulously detailed. A red Cadillac, decorated with colored grains of rice, was centered perfectly on a piece of thick paper. The artwork had more precision, more care than the others. "That Cadillac," she whispered, pointing. "That was Mr. Howard's car, his pride and joy." Ferdinand followed her gaze. "Yes, he still has it. Actually, he took it out this morning for the event." He stepped closer to the drawing, smiling with a glimmer of pride. "That one's mine. I made it as a demonstration for the kids. Wanted to show them how to use natural textures in their art. That's why it looks so neat." He chuckled, motioning to the more chaotic, glitter-covered pieces around it. But Evie didn't laugh. A chill swept through her, a strange shiver that climbed her spine and lingered in her arms. She stared at Ferdinand. His thick black curly hair, his overly bright smile, the expressive way he moved his hands when he talked, it was all familiar. Too familiar. Ferdinand caught her gaze and tilted his head slightly. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" Walter, sensing her unease, gently placed a hand on the small of her back, a quiet signal. Evie blinked. "Yes, sorry, it's just these crafts. They reminded me of my boys when they were little." She forced a smile, but inside something had shifted. A memory was stirring, one she hadn't expected, one she couldn't ignore. She hesitated, then glanced at Ferdinand. "Do you have any siblings?" she asked casually, though her voice carried an undertone of something deeper, something urgent. "Evie," Walter said softly, a cautioning note in his voice. Ferdinand gave a short, slightly awkward chuckle. "Yeah, actually, I do. My brother's at the fair today with Mr. Howard. They're helping run the booth. You should swing by if you have time. There's a children's performance coming up and the big auction. It's always fun." They thanked him for his time, and their young guide escorted them back through the sun-drenched property towards the parking area. As they walked, Evie looked over her shoulder once more. Her thoughts churned with questions she couldn't put into words, threads of memory tugging at her mind.
Back at the car, they thanked the guide again and got in. Evie's fingers trembled slightly as she fumbled with her seatbelt. The image of Ferdinand, his curly black hair, that radiant smile, and the expressive way he moved his hands lingered in her thoughts like a ghost. Walter started the engine and checked his phone. "The auction site is about 20 minutes away. Do we go?" "Absolutely," Evie said firmly, her voice tight with anticipation. "I need to speak with Howard." They pulled out onto the dusty country road, fields stretching endlessly on both sides. As they drove, Walter glanced at her, brows creased with concern. "Evie, why did you ask Ferdinand if he had siblings?" She stared out the window, watching tractors dot the horizon and sunlight shimmer off rows of crops. "I don't know," she said softly. "When I saw that Cadillac drawing, and then him, the hair, the smile, it hit me. He reminded me of Lucas." Walter shook his head, trying to stay grounded, to cling to logic. "Evie, come on. You know better than that. They look completely different. Hair texture, a smile, that's not enough." "I know," she said quickly, defensively. "I'm not saying it is him. I'm not. It's just something about him felt familiar." Walter gently patted her hand, offering comfort without saying more. The rest of the short drive passed in silence, both lost in their own tumultuous thoughts. They arrived at the county fairgrounds, a lively sprawl of color and noise. Rows of white tents, hay bales, and food stalls surrounded an open field filled with tractors, antique plows, and prize-winning livestock. Children ran between booths, their laughter carried on the breeze. Ribbons fluttered in the wind, and the intoxicating smell of roasted corn drifted through the air. "No auction going on now," Walter said, scanning the posted event schedule near the entrance. "Looks like it wrapped up earlier."
They strolled through the fair, stopping occasionally at exhibits. Evie's eyes searched every face, every corner, her heart pounding louder than the cheerful music playing through the loudspeakers. Then she saw it, a white tent with a blue banner stretched across the top. Howard's Haven for Hope. Her breath caught. Standing just outside the tent, deep in conversation with a middle-aged couple, was a man with a thick head of white hair. His gestures were animated, his posture familiar. Even from a distance, she knew it was him, Howard Fielding.
She froze. Though 3 decades had passed, she recognized him instantly. His hair had turned silver, his face now marked by deep lines, but his eyes, his mannerisms, they were exactly the same. They waited patiently until the couple said their goodbyes and walked away. Then Evie and Walter stepped forward. "Mr. Fielding," Walter said gently. The man turned toward them, polite but unsure. "Yes, can I help you?" "You probably don't remember us," Evie began, her voice a fragile thread. "I'm Evelyn Marlowe, and this is my husband, Walter. Our sons Lucas, Noah, and Gabriel were your students at Oak Ridge Elementary." Howard's brow creased as he studied them, his eyes narrowing with the effort of recalling a memory long buried. "I'm terribly sorry," he said, a genuine apology in his voice. "It's been so long. I'm nearly 70 now. Can you believe that? The memory slips more and more every year." He tapped the side of his head, smiling faintly. Evie stepped a little closer. "I helped organize your farewell party at the school. You were leaving, and the moms wanted to do something special. If there was ever a woman with 3 identical little boys following her like ducklings, it was me." Recognition slowly dawned. Howard's face softened, then lit up with a warm, genuine smile. "Of course! The Marlowe boys!" He shook his head gently, a distant fondness in his eyes. "Lucas, Noah, and Gabriel. Bright boys, all 3. How could I forget?" Then the smile faltered slightly, a shadow passing over his features. "I was heartbroken when I heard what happened. A terrible tragedy. I didn't know how to reach out. I wasn't sure if I should." "We always thought you moved out of state to teach," Evie said carefully, her eyes studying his face, searching for any tell. "That's what you told everyone." Howard shook his head. "No, I stayed in Texas. After leaving Oak Ridge, I moved to a smaller town to get a certification in agriculture and child development. I was laying the groundwork for this place," he said, gesturing towards the tent, the bustling fair, and the fields beyond. "Starting this farm was always my dream," Howard said, his tone turning nostalgic, wistful. "Something I'd been planning for years, a place where children could heal and grow."
Evie leaned forward slightly, her voice steady but pointed, a needle pricking at the surface. "Mr. Howard, do you remember the exact date you left town? Was it before or after my boys disappeared?" "Before," Howard said quickly, almost too quickly, the word sharp in the air. "It must have been before, otherwise the police would have contacted me. I was never questioned." He tilted his head slightly, a flicker of suspicion in his eyes. "Why do you ask?" Evie didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into her purse and carefully pulled out the photograph, the one she had taken from the photo album that morning. The moment still felt fresh, raw. Her hand trembled slightly as she offered it to him. "I was looking at this earlier," she said, unfolding the image. "It was taken the morning the boys disappeared, just an hour before they were gone." She pointed to the blurred edge of the frame. "That's your Cadillac, isn't it, parked across the street?" Walter stepped beside her, his voice calm but direct, cutting through the tension. "Do you remember driving through our neighborhood that day, Mr. Fielding? Were you near our house?" Howard's expression shifted. The warmth vanished from his features, replaced by something cooler, measured, guarded. His jaw tightened as he studied the photo in silence. The moment stretched, taut and agonizing. I can't remember the exact date I left town, and I certainly don't recall driving through your neighborhood or seeing your boys, not that day. He handed the photo back with steady hands, his gaze unwavering. That Cadillac must belong to someone else. Walter gave a small nod, laying a hand on Evie's shoulder, a silent signal of resignation. Well, at least now we have our answer. Evie nodded too, but she noticed the subtle change in Walter's posture, the way his jaw clenched, the way he suddenly avoided her eyes. He was trying to stay composed, but something had unsettled him. Howard looked at them again, his face unreadable, a carefully constructed mask. "Do you think the Cadillac is connected to your boy's disappearance?" "We're not sure," Walter replied, his voice neutral. "The police never brought it up back in '81. We just noticed it in the photo today."
Howard glanced at his watch. "It's nearly 3:30. We'll need to start wrapping up." He turned to two men standing behind the display table. "Let's begin packing. The event ends at 4 o'clock. Then he faced Evie and Walter again, his voice politely dismissive. "You should take a look around while there's still time. In about 5 minutes, the kids from our farm will do the closing performance. It's just over there." He pointed toward a small wooden stage at the edge of the fairgrounds. "It's quite sweet. You might enjoy it." "Thank you," Walter said, nodding. "It was good seeing you again, Howard." As they walked away from the tent, Evie trailed behind slightly. She turned her head, stealing one last, lingering glance, and then she heard it. Howard's voice, low, sharp, and urgent. He was turned away from the crowd, speaking intensely to his phone. "Leave immediately after the performance. Get Diego here." A pause. "Yes, now." Evie stopped mid-step. She turned slowly. Howard was busy directing his staff again, smiling, gesturing, as if nothing had happened, but the urgency in his voice still echoed in her ears like a warning bell. She quickened her pace and caught up to Walter. Her heart was pounding now, her mind racing with questions she didn't yet dare ask out loud. They reached the small outdoor stage where children, about 24 of them, were lining up in neat rows. Most were between 6 and 9 years old, with a few even younger. Their clothes were bright and homespun, their eyes shining with anticipation. Music started, a cheerful folk tune in Spanish, and the children began to sing. Their voices were sweet, innocent, but Evie couldn't concentrate on the melody. Her eyes scanned the crowd, the staff, the shadows behind the tents. She watched every movement, searching for something, anything that felt out of place. And then she saw him, a man moving quickly near the vendor stalls just past the edge of the stage. He walked with purpose, almost urgency, weaving through the fairgrounds like someone with a destination and a deadline. His hair caught the sunlight, dark, thick, unmistakably curly. "Walter," she whispered, grabbing his arm. "Look, over there by the vendor tents." Evie tugged at Walter's sleeve, eyes locked on the figure, striding quickly through the fairgrounds. "Look at that man," she said quietly, pointing discreetly. "The one moving fast. Do you see his hair? Doesn't he look like Ferdinand?" Walter followed her gaze, his eyes narrowing as he tracked the man weaving through the crowd. The resemblance was uncanny. "Yes," he said slowly, a dawning realization in his voice. "It's striking." "Do you think they're twins?" Evie asked, barely containing the tremble in her voice. But before Walter could answer, she was already moving, slipping between spectators, determined to get a clearer view. Walter followed closely behind, catching up as they ducked around a cotton candy stand and positioned themselves where they could observe without drawing attention. The man had reached the Howard's Haven booth and was speaking with Howard himself. Their exchange looked tense, fast words, sharp gestures. Then, as the man turned slightly to the side, Evie gasped. It was him, or rather, it was almost him. The same thick, dark curls, the same defined brow, the same bright, animated smile that mirrored Ferdinand's perfectly.
If she didn't know better, she'd swear it was the same person, except this one was clearly someone else. "This has to be the brother Ferdinand mentioned," she whispered, her voice a mix of awe and terror. "Diego, the one Howard called for." Walter's face had gone pale, his eyes fixed on the two men now deep in conversation. "The same smile, the same eyes," he said almost to himself, a haunted whisper. Evie's voice cracked as she gripped his arm. "Walter, could they be Lucas and Noah?" He said nothing, his silence a deafening roar. Evie's mind raced, desperate to articulate the whirlwind of thoughts. "Remember, Gabriel was always the smallest. His eyes were softer, easier to recognize. Noah had those thicker brows, and he was the fast one, always climbing trees. Lucas was the boldest, always leading them." Before Walter could respond, Howard suddenly turned, gesturing sharply to Diego. The two broke off their conversation and began walking briskly toward the parking area, leaving the other staff behind, visibly confused. "Why are they leaving so fast?" Evie's voice rose with concern. "We should follow them. I need to speak to that man. He has to be Diego." She moved forward, but Walter caught her arm. "Evie, wait." His voice was calm but firm, a lifeline in her escalating panic. "If they are our sons, then where's Gabriel?" Evie froze, the question a cold shock. "We should check the fairgrounds. If Gabriel's here too, then we call the police. We don't confront them yet, not without proof."
Evie nodded reluctantly, the logic cutting through her desperation. "You're right. And we know where the farm is. We can go back if we have to." They turned and moved quickly through the fair, scanning the crowd, peering behind booths and tents, searching for a third familiar face. But they found nothing. No third man. No sign of Gabriel. "Maybe we're wrong," Walter said, but even he didn't sound convinced, the words hollow. "Maybe it's just a coincidence." Evie said nothing. She was already walking back toward Howard's tent. Only one staff member remained, an older man in his 60s, with sun-weathered skin and heavy hands that looked like they'd worked fields his whole life. "Excuse me," Evie said, trying to keep her tone light, conversational. "We visited the farm earlier today and met Ferdinand. Then we saw another man here who looked just like him." "Diego?" The man nodded with a smile. "They're twins." "Twins?" Evie repeated, glancing at Walter, her heart hammering. The man chuckled. "Well, here's a fun fact. They're not just twins. They're triplets." Evie's breath caught in her throat, a gasp of pure shock. "The third one isn't here today. He works at Mr. Howard's private estate, not far from the farm." Evie and Walter turned to each other at the same time, their faces reflecting the same tumultuous mix of disbelief, hope, and a rising tide of dread. "Where is this private estate?" they asked together, their voices overlapping in a desperate, synchronized plea. The man blinked, clearly startled by the intensity of their synchronized question. "I'm sorry," he said carefully. "I can't share the owner's private address. That's confidential." He reached into a nearby box and handed Walter a brochure. "Here's the farm's public contact info if you want to learn more about our programs." "Thank you," Walter said, his voice tight, even though they already had one. They stepped away from the booth and moved to a quiet corner near a row of potted plants. The noise of the fair seemed to fade around them, replaced by the deafening roar of their own thoughts. "Walter?" Evie whispered, her voice barely holding together, ragged with emotion. "Triplets. They're triplets, and they're the right age." Walter didn't speak, but in his eyes she saw the same terrifying, exhilarating truth that had just split her world open. "Ferdinand said he's been with Howard since he was 6, Evie murmured, her voice shaking uncontrollably. Walter ran a hand through his hair, his face pale, drawn. "It can't be coincidence. The Cadillac in the photo, Howard's reaction, and
Now these 3 young men, triplets, the same age, who look so much like our boys. Evie finished, tears spilling into her voice, finally breaking free. After all these years, could we have finally found them? Without another word, they rushed back toward the parking lot, scanning desperately for Howard or Diego, but both men had vanished. Walter jumped behind the wheel and started the engine. "We're going back to the farm," he said, his voice low and determined, his knuckles white around the steering wheel. "That's where they'll go. It's where they always return." As they pulled out onto the main road, Evie was already dialing 911. The dispatcher answered, and Evie's voice trembled as she spoke. "I need to speak to a detective. It's about our cold case. Missing children from 1981. Within moments, she was transferred. "This is Detective Martinez, Missing Persons Unit. This is going to sound unbelievable, but my husband and I believe we've found our sons, our triplets, who disappeared over 30 years ago." She recounted everything, the photograph with the Cadillac, their unsettling encounter with Howard Fielding at the charity farm, and the shocking discovery of Ferdinand and Diego, 2 men who appeared identical and were confirmed to be triplets, with a third brother working off-site. "They'd be 36 now," she added, her voice steadying with a fierce resolve, "and they look exactly how we'd imagine our boys would. The man who took them, Howard Fielding, was their teacher, and when we showed him the photo, he left the event suddenly with one of the young men."
"I understand your concerns, Mrs. Marlowe," the detective replied. His voice was calm, authoritative, a steady presence in the storm of her emotions. "But I need your word. Do not confront Mr. Fielding on your own. He was a respected figure in that community, and we need to proceed with caution. My team is en route to the farm now. The local sheriff's department is being dispatched as well. They should be there in under 10 minutes. "We're almost there," Walter said, turning down the gravel road that led back to Howard's Haven for Hope. "If you see him," the detective continued, his voice firm, "maintain your distance. The fact that he left early with one of the men is significant, but we need to act carefully." "We will," Evie promised, her voice barely a whisper. They kept the line open as Walter parked the car behind a cluster of trees near the edge of the property, far enough to stay hidden, close enough to observe. Minutes passed, each ticking second an eternity. Nothing moved. Then finally, 3 figures emerged from the main farmhouse: Howard, Ferdinand, and Diego. They moved fast, tossing duffel bags into the trunk of a car, Howard's Cadillac. "They're leaving," Evie whispered into the phone, her voice breathless. "All 3 of them. They're getting into Howard's car." "Stay where you are," Detective Martinez ordered, his voice sharp with command. "We just confirmed the property is registered under an alias. We're issuing warrants now for both the farm and the private estate." Just then, 2 sheriff's cruisers turned onto the gravel road, lights flashing, sirens faintly in the distance. They pulled in swiftly, blocking the exit. "They're here," Evie said, breathless, a mix of terror and relief. "The deputies just arrived." "Stay in your vehicle," the detective said, his voice firm. "Do not engage. Let them do their job." From behind their windshield, Evie and Walter watched as 4 deputies approached the Cadillac, hands hovering near their holsters. Tension hung heavy in the air, thick and suffocating. Howard stepped out, his hands raised, but his expression a volatile mix of confusion and controlled fury. Ferdinand and Diego followed, slower, glancing at each other with wide, unsure eyes. One of the deputies began questioning Howard, who responded with animated gestures, pointing back toward the house, shaking his head with increasing urgency. Walter leaned in, watching closely. "I think the sheriff's hesitant. Howard's well known around here, respected, maybe too respected." They could hear bits of the conversation on the wind. "Been in this community for years, helps local kids, must be a misunderstanding." Evie's grip on her purse tightened. Her voice broke. "I can't wait anymore." She dropped the phone into her bag, but kept the line open. Then she stepped out of the car. "I'm not letting him walk away," Evie said through gritted teeth, a fierce determination in her eyes. Before Walter could stop her, she threw the door open and strode toward the group, purpose in every step, fear trailing behind her like a shadow. "Evie, wait!" Walter called, rushing to catch up, but she didn't stop. "Howard Fielding!" she shouted, her voice echoing across the quiet farmyard, stronger than she felt, infused with 3 decades of grief and unanswered prayers. All heads turned. Howard froze mid-sentence, his expression hardening when he saw her. His hands, still loosely raised from the deputy's approach, curled into fists at his sides. "Mrs. Marlowe," one of the deputies said quickly, stepping toward her, a warning in his voice. "Please return to your vehicle. This is an active investigation." But Evie didn't move. Instead, she reached into her purse and pulled out the old photograph, creased, sacred. She held it up, facing them all, her hand trembling but steady enough to make the truth visible. "If you're even considering letting this man go," she said, her voice fierce and raw, "then let me show you something." She held the photo higher. "These are my sons, Lucas, Noah, and Gabriel Marlowe. They disappeared on June 12, 1981. We took this photo the morning they vanished, just 1 hour before." Then she turned slowly and pointed directly at Ferdinand and Diego. "And here are 2 of them, standing right in front of you." Ferdinand and Diego stared, eyes fixed on the image. Confusion flickered across their faces, then disbelief, then a dawning, shattering recognition. Ferdinand took a slow step forward, his voice dropped to a whisper. "That's us, with Marco." Diego added softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll stay with my mother until you handle it." The deputy looked between them, a profound shock registering on his face. "There's a 3rd brother?" Both men nodded, still transfixed by the photograph, their world irrevocably altered. "I didn't do anything wrong," Howard suddenly burst out, his voice raised, a desperate, defiant cry. "I saved these boys. They were abandoned, left behind like trash." Evie's voice cracked as she stepped forward, tears spilling freely now, a torrent of long-held pain. "They were not abandoned. They were taken from our front yard. They vanished while playing outside, and we never saw them again." She turned the photo over and pointed to the blurry corner of the frame. "That's your Cadillac, isn't it, Howard? The same one you still drive?" Howard didn't answer, but his jaw clenched tight, a muscle twitching. "It's in the garage," Diego said, quietly, without looking at Howard, his gaze still fixed on his newfound mother. "Still the same car, same color, same shape." Ferdinand's eyes darted between Evie and Walter, a fragile hope blossoming in their depths. "Are you really our parents?" he asked, barely breathing, the question hanging heavy in the air. Howard had told them a different story their whole lives, that their real parents were criminals, dangerous, gone. "We were never in prison," Evie continued, her voice filled with a fierce tenderness. "That man has been lying to you all your lives, but you've grown into strong, kind men, exactly who we always believed you'd become." Diego blinked hard, stunned, the enormity of the revelation washing over him. "We're 36 now." "That's right," Evie nodded. "You were born on February 15th, 1975. The deputies exchanged looks, the weight of the moment hanging heavy in the air, a silent testament to the raw truth unfolding before them. Then the lead officer stepped forward. "Mr. Fielding, turn around. Place your hands behind your back." Howard's eyes burned with defiance, but he didn't resist. As one deputy cuffed him,
Another spoke urgently into a radio, confirming the warrant to search both the farm and the private residence.
Suddenly, the peaceful farm became a scene of intense law enforcement activity. Sheriff's cruisers pulled in, lights flashing, officers moving quickly with purpose. Forensic teams entered the house. Detectives split off, pulling Ferdinand and Diego aside for separate interviews. In the garage, they found it. The Cadillac, cherry red paint, faded with time, but unmistakable. The same car from the photograph. In Howard's office, in a locked drawer, investigators uncovered the original license plate, removed and hidden. Alongside it were forged documents, new identities for all three boys, names they'd been living under for decades. Lucas, Noah, and Gabriel, Evie told the detective, watching numbly as the documents were sealed in evidence bags, the culmination of a lifetime of searching. I know who's who. Ferdinand is Lucas. He has the same wide smile. Diego is Noah. He was always fast, agile. And Marco? Walter finished quietly, his voice thick with emotion. They're not even Mexican, though we do have some mixed heritage. It's how they were able to pass without raising questions. When asked about the third brother, Ferdinand's voice broke slightly. Howard never let Marco come to the farm. He stays at the private house, takes care of the youngest kids, mostly orphans, immigrant children. Evie closed her eyes, a fresh wave of grief and hope washing over her. Gabriel, their baby, still out there, still under Howard's control, but not for long. He told us we were rescued, Diego said quietly, staring at the floor, his voice hollow. Said our parents were immigrants who'd done something terrible and were in prison for life. We were so young when it happened, we believed him. A detective leaned forward gently. What did he do to you? The room fell into a heavy silence. Ferdinand and Diego glanced at each other, the pain of unspoken years etched deep in their expressions. Nothing bad in the last 20 years, Ferdinand said slowly, choosing his words with care. But when we were kids, it was different. He demanded total obedience. Every detail had to be done exactly his way. Diego's voice was even quieter, almost a whisper, raw with trauma. Our childhood was harsh. He'd discipline us, make us strip. Sometimes he'd touch us in ways that felt wrong, then hit us with a rattan stick. Said it was the consequence of being naughty. His eyes watered, but he didn't look away. He made us believe we were bad, that we deserved it, especially me. I used to think it was my fault. The room stayed still. Nobody spoke for several long seconds. Then, as twilight fell over the farm, a call came through from the search team stationed at Howard's private residence. We found Marco, the officer on the line reported. He's here, along with 8 other children between 4 and 10 years old. We're transporting all of them to the hospital for evaluation. Most appear scared, some are clearly traumatized. Evie's heart leapt, a frantic, joyous beat. Marco, how is he? He's confused, but physically okay, the officer reassured her. We explained the situation. He's being brought to the station now. You'll be reunited there. Him, Ferdinand, Diego, and both of you. Night settled slowly across the landscape as Evie and Walter were escorted into the back of a patrol car. Behind them, the lights of the farm faded into the darkness. A place that had once been their son's prison, and for a time their home, was now finally exposed. Evie held Walter's hand tightly, eyes locked on the road ahead, tears streaming down her face, a mix of sorrow and overwhelming relief. Our boys! We found our boys! The fluorescent lights in the police station buzzed faintly, casting pale shadows across the scuffed linoleum floor. In a small interview room,
Evie sat stiffly at a metal table, a styrofoam cup of coffee cooling in front of her. Detective Martinez sat across from her, a recording device between them. His notepad lay open, pen poised. She spoke clearly, her hands knotted tightly in her lap. Our neighborhood back then, it was close. Everyone knew each other. Howard was respected. He was their favorite teacher. Parents trusted him. Sometimes he'd drive students home, with permission, of course. She paused, a wave of regret washing over her. That day, June 12th, 1981, Walter and I were both home, but it was a different time. We let the boys play outside by themselves. The neighbors all knew them. It felt safe. The detective nodded. You didn't see them being taken.
Evie shook her head, eyes brimming again. I was folding laundry in the back room. Walter was fixing something in the backyard. Neither of us was near the front window. Her voice cracked, a raw wound. One moment they were right there in the front yard, and the next they were just gone. Detective Martinez made a few quiet notes. Then he looked up. Mrs. Marlowe, we've spoken to Howard Fielding. He's decided not to fight the charges. He's cooperating, confessing, even. Evie sat up straighter, a jolt of anticipation. What did he say? He said he always felt a strange connection to the boys. He told us that on the afternoon before he was supposed to leave town, he made the decision to take them. Martinez flipped through his notes. He lured them with ice cream, promised a short drive in his Cadillac. Apparently the boys, especially Lucas, were fascinated by the car. Evie closed her eyes, a fresh wave of pain washing over her. Lucas loved that car. He had the kidnapping planned, the detective continued. He'd packed bags in advance, forged documents, used those to cross county lines undetected. Later, he returned and quietly purchased the farm property under a false LLC, claimed it was a non-profit for migrant youth. Walter had joined them now, seated beside Evie, his face tight with disbelief. But how did no one see anything? He asked, his voice strained. No witnesses? No screams? Martinez shook his head slowly. To the outside world, he was a trusted figure, a teacher, offering 3 curious little boys a ride in a fancy car. No one questioned it. And once he had them, he told them something terrifying. He flinched. He said their home was unsafe. Martinez explained that their parents were in danger or already gone. And then, little by little, he rewrote their world. Over time, they believed him. Evie stared at the tabletop, her voice soft and haunted. They trusted him, and he turned them against us. They were only 6 years old, Detective Martinez continued, his voice quiet, compassionate, completely dependent, eager to please. At that age, it was relatively easy to manipulate them. Walter reached across the table, taking Evie's hand in his. His face was pale, lined with fury and grief. He told them they were orphaned, the detective went on, said they were the children of undocumented immigrants, that you both had hidden the truth about their origins and that you'd been imprisoned for life. Evie's lips parted in disbelief, a silent scream. He created photo albums, fabricated documents, layer after layer of lies. He built an entire false history for them. Evie swallowed hard, her throat tight. So the motive was what? Fascination?
The detective nodded grimly. We've looked into his past. In the early 1970s, Howard Fielding lost his wife and twin sons in a house fire. The trauma went largely untreated. Outwardly, he seemed to function, but internally he fractured. According to his statements and early psychological assessments, he came to believe that certain children,
Children with deep emotional bonds were meant to be his. Evie closed her eyes. The weight of it all settled like a stone in her chest. Triplets, she whispered, the word a fresh wound. Triplets? Martinez echoed. He saw them as a second chance. He convinced himself he was saving them. Walter's voice was low and tight, filled with a simmering rage. What happens now? Mr. Fielding will face multiple charges, the detective replied, his tone firm, official. Kidnapping, child abuse, false imprisonment, identity fraud, the list goes on. As for the younger children found at his residence, they're being evaluated. We've already begun the process of identifying them and locating their families. He stood and crossed to the door. But I think there are 3 people who've waited long enough to see you. He spoke quietly to someone in the hallway. A few heartbeats later, the door opened again, and there they were. Ferdinand, Diego, Marco, Lucas, Noah, Gabriel. They stood in the doorway, uncertain, hesitant, but very much real. Grown men now, shaped by years lost and truths long buried. But even in their adult faces, Evie saw the traces of the boys she had once held close. Lucas's unmistakable wide smile, Noah's thoughtful, steady gaze, Gabriel's smaller frame, still the quiet one. For a moment, no one moved. 30 years of silence stretched between them. A lifetime of birthdays missed, scraped knees unwitnessed, graduations, first loves, heartbreaks, all lived without a mother's hug, without a father's hand on the shoulder. Then Evie stood. A sob escaped her chest, half joy, half anguish, a primal sound of relief and sorrow. She took one step forward, then another, her body trembling. Walter rose beside her, tears streaking down his cheeks, unashamed. "My boys," she whispered, her voice cracking, barely audible. "My beautiful boys." It was Lucas who moved first. He crossed the room in 3 quick steps and pulled his mother into a desperate embrace. Noah and Gabriel followed, wrapping their arms around her, around Walter, around each other. And for the first time in 30 days, the 5 of them stood as a family again. No words, just the sound of breath and weeping, of lives reconnecting, of years unraveling. Evie placed her hands on their faces one by one, memorizing them all over again, lines and edges grown older, but still hers. "I never stopped looking for you," she said through her tears. "Not for one single day." Gabriel looked at her, his voice soft as a sigh. "We didn't know. We thought you were gone. But we're here now. We're all here now." Outside, stars blinked into the darkening Texas sky, indifferent and eternal. But inside, that interview room, under harsh fluorescent light, surrounded by file cabinets and scratched tables, a miracle had taken root. A broken family, torn apart by obsession and lies, stood whole again, not healed, not yet, but together. And finally, after 30 years of silence, that was enough.